Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Whether you're watching or listening, we really appreciate you being here. Something big is unfolding at airports across the United States, and it's raising serious questions. Long lines, rising frustration, and now a shocking proposal, deploying the National Guard to take control of the chaos. But is this a necessary emergency move or something much bigger? In the next few minutes, we're breaking down exactly what's happening, why it matters, and what could come next. Before we dive in, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the latest updates on stories that impact millions. And I want to hear from you. Do you think this plan is justified or does it go too far? Drop your opinion in the comments below. This is one debate you don't want to sit out.
Yeah, and our mission for this deep dive is to really look past those immediate headlines, We need to examine the structural and the security implications of this exact scenario. Because we have to analyze what actually happens to our domestic infrastructure when specialized forces, whether that means immigration enforcement or the military, are just deployed to manage civilian airport operations.
So let's start with the reality on the ground right now.
Yeah.
Because the situation at the terminals is just deteriorating so rapidly.
It's a complete mess.
It really is. We are looking at an ongoing partial government shutdown that started last month, and the most visible, chaotic casualty of this whole political standoff is the civilian airport.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're seeing hours-long lines wrapping around baggage claims, missed flights, and just a profound level of frustration from you, the traveling public. But it's vital to understand the actual mechanics of why this is happening.
Right, because the TSA agents haven't just vanished into thin air.
Exactly. They are classified as essential personnel,
Where?
which means they are legally required to show up to work.
They're required to work, but they are doing so without pay. And that right there is where the mechanical failure of the system really begins.
Wow, yeah.
Because a government shutdown doesn't just immediately lock the doors of the airport, right? It initiates this slow motion collapse of the labor force.
Like a domino effect.
Precisely. When frontline workers miss consecutive paychecks, you begin to see that cascading effect. They can't afford childcare, they can't afford the commute, and the inevitable result is a massive spike in unscheduled absences.
People are just calling in sick to manage the financial fallout in their own personal lives.
Exactly, which
Yeah.
brings the entire logistics network to its knees.
Right, because if you think about civilian airport infrastructure, it's basically a massive, highly calibrated sorting machine.
That's a great way to put it.
It requires a very specific number of trained personnel, all operating in perfect synchronization, just to process human beings and cargo securely. The TSA acts as like the lubricating oil for that physical hardware.
Yeah.
Without their standard operational capacity, the physical space of the airport essentially just becomes a warehouse. The friction at those security checkpoints is currently overwhelming the system.
And so to manage that overwhelming friction, we saw an unprecedented stopgap measure initiated just on Monday.
The ICE redeployment.
Right. Personnel from ICE were physically redeployed into these civilian airports to assist the TSA and, attempt to untangle these massive bottlenecks.
I want to dig into how that actually works on a functional level, because ICE agents, they're specialized in immigration and customs enforcement.
Probably a different skill set.
Yeah. They aren't cross-trained to read the specific color gradients on a TSA bag scanner, and they definitely aren't certified in transportation security protocols.
Yeah.
So how are they actually mitigating the bottleneck?
Well, looking at the latest updates, it appears they're taking over the periphery.
Okay, like what?
Like managing the physical queue, executing initial ID and boarding pass verifications, and handling the perimeter behavioral observation.
Got it. Which theoretically frees up the remaining credentialed TSA staff to focus exclusively on the technical screening of bags and passengers.
That operational division of labor is how they're attempting to keep the system moving. But relying on an entirely separate law enforcement agency to conduct line management at domestic transit hubs, it's just a temporary bandage on a structural hemorrhage.
Right.
It is a massive reallocation of resources that literally pulls ICE away from its primary directives.
And that strain is exactly what brings us to the escalation.
Yeah.
And frankly, this is where the stakes of this conversation get incredibly high.
Yeah, they really do.
During a recent event in Memphis, Tennessee, President Donald Trump floated a genuinely shocking proposal. He suggested that if the ICE agents are unable to handle the mounting crowds and stabilize the airports, he might deploy the National Guard nationwide to take control of the situation.
moving straight from a bureaucratic funding delay to a potential nationwide deployment of military reserves into civilian transit hubs.
Okay, let me stop you right there, though, because I want to push back a bit on the idea that this is some unprecedented apocalyptic shift in security.
Okay, go ahead.
I hear National Guard at the airport, and my mind immediately goes back to late 2001.
Right, post 9/11.
Exactly. After 9/11, we had troops in fatigues standing next to the food court in almost every major airport in the country. But let's be real, they were mostly there for psychological comfort.
They provided a high visibility deterrent.
Right. But they certainly weren't running the baggage carousels or operating the metal detectors. So when you talk about a fundamental shift in domestic security, aren't we overstating things just a little bit? If the Guard is deployed now, wouldn't they just be doing the same kind of basic crowd control and optics we've seen before?
It's a fair comparison to make, and the historical parallel to 2001 is important. But the underlying context here is entirely different.
How so?
That context is exactly what dictates the geostrategic shift. In 2001, the military was deployed to a civilian space in response to an external, catastrophic terror threat.
It was an actual attack.
Right. The presence of the National Guard was an execution of defense. What is being proposed now is the use of military reserves to bypass a legislative funding dispute.
Oh, wow. We are talking about utilizing the armed forces to patch an administrative vulnerability, not a kinetic threat.
So it's the reason for the deployment that changes the nature of the space, not just the physical presence of the troops.
Exactly that. Military forces and specialized immigration units are primarily designed for interdiction, defense, and containment.
Right.
A civilian airport is fundamentally built around the concept of free movement, flow, and commerce.
Which are total opposites.
Yes. When you take the emergency state apparatus and use it to keep global and domestic travel corridors functioning simply because the standard administrative budget hasn't been passed, you are normalizing the military's presence in everyday civilian logistics.
That is a huge shift.
And there are deep legal complexities here, too.
You're talking about the boundaries of what the military is legally allowed to do on U.S. soil.
Yes, because the Posse Comitatus Act generally prohibits the use of federal military forces to enforce domestic policies.
Okay, but the National Guard is a little different. The National Guard can operate under Title 32, meaning that they remain under the command of state governors, which does provide a legal pathway for domestic deployment.
Right.
But a nationwide directive utilizing those troops to manage civilian airport queues. That blurs the lines between civilian administration and national defense operations in a way that permanently alters the American public's everyday relationship with the military.
You go from interacting with a civilian administrative worker to a military reservist just to board a domestic flight to see your family.
Exactly.
To understand why we're moving military assets to terminal gates, we have to look at the paperwork freezing the funds. Because none of this is happening in a vacuum.
No, not at all.
It is the direct physical manifestation of the standoff on Capitol Hill. So let's look at the underlying mechanics of this impasse, because it's vital to understand why TSA is starved of resources while ICE is actively deploying.
Right. The trigger for this entire partial government shutdown is a legislative standoff over the budget for DHS.
The Department of Homeland Security.
Exactly. Democratic lawmakers have refused to pass funding for the department unless the legislation includes specific mandated reforms to ICE.
And I think a lot of people listening might wonder, how does a debate over ICE reforms manage to shut down the airport security lines?
It all comes down to the organizational chart.
Right, because DHS is a massive umbrella organization. It houses both ICE and the TSA, along with FEMA, the Coast Guard, and several others.
Yeah.
Because the budget is tied to the department as a whole, freezing DHS funding immediately freezes the TSA's operating budget. That single point of leverage is what cascades down into the empty checkpoints and the massive lines we are analyzing today.
So the political disagreement over the operational mandate of one agency completely paralyzes the operational capacity of an entirely different agency within the same bureaucratic structure.
And the political rhetoric surrounding who bears the responsibility for this paralysis is really intensifying.
Oh, definitely.
During that speech in Memphis, President Trump laid out his perspective without any ambiguity. He stated that the Democrats are fully to blame for the struggles the American public is facing at the airports.
Right.
He actually characterized the refusal to fund DHS without those specific ICE reforms as extortion. And he made the claim that they are holding up money that has essentially already been approved in principle for the rest of the department.
So the narrative from the executive branch is that the opposition party is weaponizing the broader departmental budget to force ideological changes on a single agency.
But looking at the latest info from Capitol Hill, that narrative leaves out a critical piece of the tactical negotiation.
It really does.
Recent updates revealed that there was a highly specific offer put on the table by Republican Senate leadership, an offer that would have ended the airport crisis entirely.
And the mechanics of that offer are fascinating from a legislative strategy standpoint.
Break that down for us.
Well, the Republican Senate leadership proposed a funding structure that would have fully funded every single agency under the DHS umbrella.
Which critically includes the TSA.
Yes, fully funded, with one sole exception.
ICE.
Exactly. The sole exception of ICE.
Meaning the president's own party offered a deal to turn the lights back on at the airports, pay the TSA screeners, fund the Coast Guard, and handle all the other administrative necessities.
Yeah.
Simply by carving out the disputed ICE funding to be debated as a standalone issue.
Right. But the latest info indicates that President Trump personally rejected that offer. He flat out refused to decouple ICE from the rest of the DHS budget.
Because by rejecting the carve-out, the strategy is clearly to maintain maximum pressure.
Right. Precisely. The executive branch recognizes that the mounting public fury over the airport delays is a very powerful point of leverage.
Right. If you fund the TSA and alleviate the travel chaos, the immediate public pressure to pass the broader DHS budget just dissipates,
Leaving the administration with significantly less leverage to secure the ICE funding without conceding to the demanded reforms.
That makes perfect sense. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? I really want to highlight the profound irony embedded in the mechanics of this standoff, because the causality loop here is almost unbelievable.
It really is something else.
The entire government funding lapse. The reason TSA agents aren't being paid, the reason the entire domestic travel network is suffocating, is fundamentally centered around a dispute over funding for ICE.
Right.
And yet, ICE is the exact agency currently being deployed to bandage the resulting crisis at those very airports.
It is a striking operational contradiction. The agency at the very center of the funding dispute is being actively utilized as the emergency mechanism to solve the downstream effects of that exact same dispute.
It's like shutting down a city's entire electrical grid because of a fierce political debate over the budget for the streetlight maintenance department.
Okay, that's a good analogy.
And then deploying the streetlight technicians to manually direct traffic in the dark while the rest of the city collapses.
Exactly. It is a completely circular situation that forces us to question the resilience of our entire domestic infrastructure.
Yeah, no kidding.
And this raises an important question, one that extends far beyond the current standoff in Washington.
What's that?
Well, if military reserves and specialized border enforcement personnel become the normalized default backup plan for civilian infrastructure failures, how might that permanently change the nature of domestic travel?
Wow.
We really have to consider what it means for the American public's relationship with security forces when the military becomes the ultimate guarantor of civilian administrative function.
That is the perfect question to leave hanging in the air. So what stands out to you in all of this? Is deploying the National Guard to run airport logistics just a pragmatic, temporary fix to get planes off the ground during a political gridlock? Or are we watching a permanent shift in how our civilian spaces are governed and secured? Let us know what you think.
Yeah, drop your thoughts in the comments.
We want to sincerely thank everyone for listening or watching today. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep an eye on how the bigger picture impacts your everyday life.
See you in the next one.